to me is actually really, really interesting. The reason why it's really, really interesting is because, yeah, there is regulation in the California energy sector, and more specifically in electricity. And there was a really, really interesting screw up in the energy industry in the late 1999, early 2000s, where we started having problems. So that I actually want to talk about. But in order to understand it, we need to talk about what was the regulation and the deregulation that actually was happening during that time. And that's basically where I want to focus my discussion today. Okay, so four main functions of supply of energy. Energy generation, so this is your power plant. Transmission is basically sending the electricity from the power plant to the utilities. And then the distribution, so this is via high voltage wires, and then the distribution is via these low voltage wires, so the ones that are, you know, on some places just beside the street. I think in many places here in California it's actually underneath the ground. Low voltage transmission to the households. And then retailing is essentially the utility trying to figure out how much you consumed and how much is the price that they actually are going to be charging. So there were four parts. Now, prior to, I guess, the deregulation, so, you know, in the 1980s and prior, okay, all these functions were done by one firm, one vertically integrated firm within a geographical area. It doesn't have to be one for the whole California. Okay, Edison was in Southern California, PG&E was in Northern California, and then, you know, National Power was in Roseville. Okay, but there was only one firm. One firm owned the power generators. They owned the transmission lines, and they owned the low voltage transmission that distributed to the electricity to the households, and they also owned the meters. Okay, and so basically what happened was there were a few laws that kind of happened in the 80s that essentially set the stage for deregulation. So again, we have this cycle of regulation, deregulation in the market. Okay, so we were regulated, we deregulated. Some states went back to regulation, others deregulated, and so on. Okay, I have a picture in here that kind of like helps you understand a few things. I actually have a lot of these things that I drew to try and make you understand this. Yeah. Now, before I continue, I do want to point out that, you know, there's so many facets in the electricity industry that it is very, very difficult to model the whole thing. Okay, so all I'm doing right now is I'm trying to draw the things that I need in order to complete my story. This definitely is not the whole thing. Okay, don't expect yourselves to be experts once you go through all the slides. Okay, so anyway, so what we have is we have a bunch of these generators. Now I actually put a few colors in here. And the reason for that is because there are some generators that are power plants that tend to be cleaner, and there are some that tend to not be cleaner. It's a completely different set of rules where the load servicing entity, like or your utility, like PG&E, okay, needs to buy a certain amount of renewable energy and so on, right? So they have to choose from whichever of these power generators they should be getting electricity, and they have to maintain a certain proportion. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about that, but that definitely is one of the things that the utilities need to figure out. So there are generators, and then the generators essentially will try and send the electricity via, again, the high voltage lines to the utility. The utility will then sell it to the households and the firms. Okay. Again, before this whole thing over here was one firm. Okay, and then a few things changed. So what were some of these changes? Um, so the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA of 1978, basically allowed non-utility generators. So if you have a power plant, you can try and sell electricity to PG&E. Okay, they will allow that. They will not allow you to sell to consumers directly, but you can sell to the utility. Okay, and one of the requirements also was that it required the non-utility generator. So if you have a power plant, you have to sell to your local utilities only. So that could be a problem. Maybe the utility that actually is close by will only pay you way less, whereas if you actually send it to LA, it might actually pay you more. But unfortunately, you are stuck only to whichever is local. Okay, the Energy Policy Act of 1992 allowed the non-utility generators to sell through the regional transmission lines. So you could be generating power in Northern California, and as long as there is space in the regional transmission lines, so these, if you drive through from LA to San Francisco or to Sacramento, you see these, like, on I-5, these large transmission lines. Okay, so as long as you can actually transmit the power through these lines, you can actually sell electricity to LA. Okay, so the 1986 Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Order 888 basically required that the owners of the transmission wires, the high voltage wires, were required to provide connection services to the power generators. So if you have a power plant here, say for example in Sacramento, and you want to sell it to LA, you want to sell your power to LA, the owner of the transmission line has to allow you to use the transmission lines. Okay, they will charge you a fee, but the fee that they should be charging you, or whatever it is they are requiring, okay, should be the same as what they would be requiring if they actually were the ones who would be using the transmission lines themselves. So if they're going to pay themselves 2 cents per kilowatt hour, then they should charge the power plant also 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So all of these essentially are the building blocks for the for the deregulation. So it set the stage for the deregulation in California in 1998. Okay. Now, really quick, I have a picture in here. It shows you. Okay, so you have a bunch of these regulators, right? The regulators, the generators would essentially send the power to the utilities. So the utility is a load servicing entity, or the utility. Okay, so these are your high voltage lines. Notice I actually had a few different colors in here. Okay, so when you are buying power from a bunch of generators, there is a requirement for how much of the electricity that you are actually buying should be renewable. And so, I think let's just go with the lighter gray as cleaner than the darker gray as opposed to the black. So part of the requirement is also trying to figure out which one is the clean energy and how much, right? So if the utility is required to purchase 33% of its power from clean resources, then that also should be part of their, part of their decision making. Okay. Now, so the generators will sell the electricity to the utility. The utility, using low voltage lines, will sell the electricity to the households. Right, so you have a meter. They will measure how much you use in a given month, and then they charge you a price. Now, so this was prior to the regulation. Now, basically, what happened? We restructured. Restructured is we deregulated. Okay, what was the reason? Like, California was actually paying really high prices, and they wanted to find ways to try and improve competition in the power generation and distribution, and hopefully by allowing competition, it would lower the costs. So they had a 4-year transition plan approved in 1998. Okay, so you have your utility, you have your, they created the California Power Exchange, I'll talk about that, and the Cal ISO. So who was the California Power Exchange? Well, they will be in charge of auctioning and figuring out the equilibrium price. So first and foremost, it is the job of the Cal ISO. So let me skip. I'll come back to these 2 slides. The ISO, by the way, the Cal ISO is in Folsom. Okay, so in the California Independent System Operator, they will make a decision as to how much electricity, say for example, Sacramento needs. Okay, and based on whatever that quantity is, they will figure out how much we want to buy. They will now call all of the utilities. You know, I mean, Sacramento might have more than one utility because, you know, Roseville has their own and Sacramento has their own. So they will figure out how much the utilities are willing to pay. They will rank it down. Yeah. And then they also will figure out how much the firms are willing to sell. Right. So between right now what we have is 1:27 a.m. So for, say for example, 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, a 1-hour time slot. Okay. How much would power plant A be willing to sell 100 megawatts? Power plant A would say 6 cents. Okay. Power plant B would say 7 cents. Power plant C would say 15 cents, and so on. They will rank it out and in ascending order. And once they figure out what the quantity is, there is a demand, there is a supply, and you will find an equilibrium. That equilibrium is the market clearing price for 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. And they will do it again for 5 to 6. They will do it again for 6, 7, and so on. So they will do it a few hours ahead. They may even do that, you know, purchase the power for the whole day. They'll try and figure it out, but there is an equilibrium price. So obviously, they're hoping that the equilibrium price will result into the most efficient price, right? Because this is the equilibrium price, and obviously the utility will have a consumer surplus, and the power generator will have their own producer surplus. And the competition will force the firms to essentially place a bid, and their bid should be equal to their marginal cost. Why? Because if you will try and be willing, you know, it costs you this much and you want to receive a much higher amount. If for some reason, you know, the ISO determines only a certain quantity will be bought, then your power generating ability might not actually be bought for this particular time period, and so you lose out on your revenues. So it's always the best incentive for the firm to try and sell at their marginal cost. And effectively, once they know what their marginal cost is, they're hoping that the equilibrium price will be higher, and they will get the difference. And the difference is their produced surplus. Okay, so the auctioning is done by the California Power Exchange. The ISO will determine how much they will make the estimates of how much, and they will also make sure that the generators will have access, non-discriminated access to the use of the transmission lines. Okay, I think it's a lot easier for you to understand it if you see it this way, right? So I just cut and paste a picture of California, and I just have a few. So these are nuclear power plants. I put one south of Sacramento because there is one south of Sacramento. It's already decommissioned. And then I have some natural gas and some other fossil fuel power plants. Now there also are like some wind farms. So if you've ever driven from Sacramento to the Bay Area, and if you've used like 5 to 205 somewhere before you hit, I think like Livermore, you probably will see between Tracy and Livermore, you probably will see the you'll see the wind farms around this part over here, right? So they also will have that as their power generators. So once you have this thing, I actually just drew a line in here. Let's just say it's kind of close to where I-5 goes through. But let's say this is the main transmission lines, right? So if you happen to be LA and you need a certain amount of power, then basically all of these guys in here will make a bid. And there is a price that you also have to pay. So this guy here can sell to LA as long as the price that they are charging plus the price to use the transmission lines is lower than any of these guys over here. Then yeah, you are free to sell. If you are over here, you are free to sell to the grid in LA. So that essentially is the innovation that they have. And by allowing that, right, then the consumers, the utilities will now pay for the least costly power, which again will be passed on to the consumers. And hopefully that will lower the costs of electricity in California. Okay. As a result of this transition, what actually happened was, yeah, in 1998, California's electric bill now became a little bit more complicated. So there is a cost of the power that is actually generated. There is a cost to the transmission. So there is a cost to using the transmission lines. Okay, and keep in mind, it's not like one firm owns the whole transmission line. If there's a utility before, there's a utility here, then they own this part. There's another utility that might own this part, and so on. There's a utility that might own just this part over here, and I made the lines a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner, because yeah, that transition capacity might actually be smaller. Keep in mind, the transmission capacity is not limitless, and so there may be a bunch of these guys who want to sell power to LA, but if their ability to generate, say for example, they have a lot of excess capacity, and they have say 500 megawatts, but only 300 megawatts can travel, then effectively what's going to happen is the ISO will determine which of these three and how much from each of them. For a total of 300 megawatts will be traveling from this part to this part. And the transmission charge ultimately will also determine how much from here will be sold to the southern part, and vice versa. Okay, so why did we have an energy crisis? Okay, well, we had an energy crisis because essentially what they found was that the prices of electricity went up. So I think the best way to kind of like understand this is let's just go with a simple supply and demand diagram. Okay, again, the auction is done at the Cal Power Exchange, right? So one of the things that we found out, okay, was the prices was going up, right? And the reason why the prices were going up partly was, yeah, there were increases in demand during the summer, right? So an increase in demand will result into an increase in the equilibrium. Actually, let me leave this here, right? Let's draw a different line. So it started out, from winter, the demand might be here, and then the demand shifts out, right? So an increase in demand definitely will result to an increase in the equilibrium price. I drew the supply and demand diagram, by the way, to be very, very inelastic. And the reason why it is inelastic is because that's essentially what we have. The demand for electricity is not very, very flat. It actually is very, very steep, and more so with the supply. It's not like, there's a bunch of new power plants that will show up once there is a need for it, and it will just go away when there is no need for it. No, the supply of the electricity is actually very, very fixed. So one of the things that we found out was, aside from increases in demand, some of these electric providers, as a result of the new rulings since 1998, were actually kind of like colluding with each other. And the way they were doing that was they were scheduling, okay? Oh, there's 7 of us who are selling electricity in Sacramento. Okay, firm number 1, why don't you shut down on Monday? And so there will only be 6 of us. And when there's 6 of us, the small decrease in the supply, so the supply decreases, it shifts to the left. Small decrease in supply will result into a very, very large increase in the price. Right? Keep in mind, if you still remember your results in Econ 1B, if you have a demand curve and demand curve is very inelastic, then raising the price, okay, will result into a small decrease in the quantity demanded, and it will result into a very, very large increase in total revenue. So if you decrease how much you sold, decrease your supply by 10%, maybe the price will rise by 30%. And the increase in the prices by 30% will be more than enough to compensate the firm that shut down on Monday, right? So the revenues would actually be higher if one of them on certain days would actually cut back, or maybe some of them on certain hours, peak hours, during the summer when demand for air conditioning is high. What if we just have them cut back by 2%, and then the prices will go up by way higher than that? Okay. The thing that made the problem even worse was the fact that the deregulation was not complete deregulation. So given the picture I drew a while ago, the price that your utility, so if we have SMUD, the price that SMUD can charge the households was actually capped at 90% of the 1996 prices. So it was capped at 65%, $65 per megawatt hour, or about 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So SMUD can only charge us a number up to 6.5 cents. This part here, the generation and how much the utility buys from the generator plus the transmission, well, that one was not capped. And so in summer of 2000, it went as high as $400 per megawatt hour, or 40 cents. And there were even very, very brief periods where it went as high as $2,000, so $2 per kilowatt hour, right? Think of it, your PG&E or your SMUD, you're buying electricity from the generator for $2 to sell it to the consumer for 6 cents. Okay? And as a result of that, on the extra 10 megawatts that they should have paid, $2,000 per megawatt, rather than buy it to sell it for 60 cents or for 6 cents, the utility decided, I'd rather not buy it, have less electricity than what we need, and effectively have rolling brownouts. Okay, so from 2000 all the way until 2003. At Sacramento, we had it only in 2000, maybe 2001. But in some other parts of California, it went as far as like 2002, maybe early 2003. By 2003, it was gone. Okay, so we had rolling brownouts. Rather than pay exorbitant prices for the last 50 megawatts, we would rather not have electricity and cut the power in different places. So maybe 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, Sacramento will have no power, and then 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, Vacaville will have no power, and so on. So that was our rolling brownouts. And the thing there is, while that actually was happening, the utility was effectively going bankrupt, and the power generators were essentially making a killing. Okay. Again, all of this because of our attempt to deregulate, our attempt to restructure. But it was partial restructuring. It was only on this part that was deregulated, but not on this part over here. Okay, so there's a picture in here that kind of shows what the firms did. So they just withdrew the supply by a tad bit, resulting into a very, very large increase in the equilibrium price. And they were able to generate a much larger revenue than how much they would have cut back, how much they would have lost because they cut back the quantity from the other firm. Okay, so not that one. Okay, so we had our problem. The state of California, after a while, figured out that, yeah, it actually wasn't like some weird event that happened. It was more of an organized thing by the power generators. And so what we did was we actually sued, and we successfully sued companies like Dynegy. I think Dynegy wanted to merge with Enron, and then something happened with Enron that prevented them from merging. But we sued these guys. We sued Reliant of Houston. By the way, Enron also, I think, was headquartered in Houston. Duke, okay, we sued all of these guys because they essentially were making a killing, right? They were still selling the same amount of electricity, um, but because they were selling it at much higher prices, they essentially were making very, very large producer surpluses and very, very large profits. Okay, so that was the California energy problem that we had, or the crises, 2000, 2001. Okay, so what have we learned with our attempts to restructure? Well, number one thing that we learned, okay, or at least we noticed, was we were hoping for significant decreases in retail prices of electricity, but there actually wasn't much of that. Okay, so there was no evidence it lowered the cost. Now, because of the problem with California, by the way, today is not deregulated. So we attempted to deregulate, and then we basically went back. And I think as of right now, our attempt to restructure is suspended. There are some states, I think Oregon is deregulated or restructured. Texas, I think Oklahoma, a few states in the South are also restructured. Okay, and again, there is no very clear evidence that the price of electricity actually is lower in those states. Okay, one thing we also noticed is as a result of the restructuring of electricity, the retail price of electricity, so the equilibrium price, is now closer to the price of natural gas. So they have a picture in here that kind of showed you that, right? In deregulated, this is misspelled, in deregulated markets, this was the equilibrium price of electricity. And this is for the these are for the regulated ones, right? So California, I guess, is back to regulation, so we are here. Okay, this is the price of natural gas. And what we noticed is that the prices of electricity is now closer to the price of natural gas for the regulated, for the deregulated places. So Texas, the prices of their electricity is closer to the price of natural gas. Now, why natural gas? Well, natural gas, because whenever you have a bunch of power plants, okay, nuclear is cheaper. I think we talked about that some time back. Wind is cheaper, okay, and if for some reason we need more electricity, then we fire up our natural gas plants, our diesel-fired plants. I don't think we have diesel-fired plants here in California, because those before used to be very, very dirty. But we will fire those up. So that's the last. So I think going back to this one, that essentially is the last one. So if there's an increase in demand, it's the diesel and the natural gas will be the ones with higher marginal cost. And so if there is an increase in demand, that will result into an increase in the price, and that is reflective of the price of natural gas. Okay. We talked about that. Okay. One thing we also noticed is one trend that we had, at least, especially here in California, is we now started to see distributed generation. So what that means is we generate the electricity closer to where it is consumed, as opposed to in large utility-owned power plants. Okay, so a good example of distributed generation is solar panels. So we now start seeing more electricity generated in solar panels that are closer to the home, as opposed to, again, having a power plant. What are the advantages? Okay, well, there definitely is now less cost to distribute the electricity because you don't need large transmission lines anymore. Right? Many of these firms generate their own power. You don't even have to go out of your house to send the power. To send the power to your house. Okay, because you have a bunch of these multiple solar panels all across your neighborhood. Okay, if one of these solar panels fail, then effectively we can still power that house through other sources, right? Through the power plant, as opposed to before, where we only relied on a power plant, and if that power plant failed, then and if that power plant, say for example, produced, I don't know, 500 megawatts of power, then that might result into the loss of power in a city of, I don't know, 10,000 homes. So one power plant goes down, 10,000 homes lose their lights. Now that we have a bunch of these smaller power generating units, if one of them fails, the others can essentially kick in. Okay, and one more thing, because of distributed generation, instead of large power plants, then we reduce the externalities, we reduce the pollution. Now, having said that, these are the advantages. The big disadvantage is, solar panels. I think it's on the next slide. Solar panels effectively do not take advantage of economies of scale. Okay, one of the things that actually has happened, okay, because the government was really trying to convince homeowners to have solar panels, okay, was we now had this thing called net metering. You have a solar panel on your rooftop, it generates a certain amount of electricity, and all you will be buying from the grid is the difference between your consumption and what you can generate. It is possible that what you are consuming is smaller than what you can generate. So you can actually sell some of the electricity back into the grid. Okay. Now, what actually happened before was that the utilities could generate the power for 7 cents. The solar panel will generate it, and the utility was paying the household higher than 7 cents. So they're paying 15 cents per kilowatt hour if they bought it from the household, but only 7 cents if they generated it themselves. So what actually happened was, they did that because they wanted to encourage solar panels and homes, but by paying more than what the cost is to the utility, it resulted into overproduction of electricity through solar panels. So one of the things that they actually are doing right now, and you probably have heard of, is that many of these utilities now are requiring a monthly connection charge. If you have a home that has solar panels, right? If you want to sell to the utility, they are requiring a monthly charge, somewhere between $20 or more for you to be able to sell to the grid. Okay, because we effectively have over-invested in less efficient technology to generate electricity. Okay, another problem with solar panels is solar energy is intermittent. Okay, the issue here is we want to invest. We want to spend less, say for example, on building gas or natural gas powered plants. Well, with solar energy, you invest in solar energy, you invest in the solar panels, but you also need to still redundantly invest in a power plant, because at night or on certain times, if it's cloudy, you don't get enough electricity. So before you had a power plant and that powered the whole grid. Now you have solar panels and you still need a power plant. So you essentially are now double investing on electric generation. So that is an issue. And so as a result of that, right, if you have a natural gas plant that is only running at half the time, then the average cost per unit of the electricity generates is still going to be higher. And then finally in here, what are some of the predictions on what's going to happen in electricity? Well, many things will change. Competition changes, technology changes, and depending on what happens with technology and so on, it probably will determine the path to what's going to happen in electricity, right? If there is a significant change in the demand for electricity, okay, it may result into there's a significant decrease. It may result into significantly lower prices of equilibrium prices because consumers are not using as much electricity, right? So this switch from incandescent lights to these energy efficient bulbs, okay, that lasts a very, very long time, will result into a decline in demand. And if we have a significant amount of households that will be using that, we might not need as much electric generation ability. Okay, so basically this is all of what I wanted to talk about in this chapter. Now, the chapter again has a second part. The second part talks about oil. I'm not going to talk about that. It will not be on the exam. The only thing I will be including in the exam is whatever we have talked about today.